Right, good day to you, Year 9, and welcome to lesson number 3 of week 11, where we are continuing our journey with photosynthesis. This will be the last lesson on photosynthesis before we move on to the next energy in biology chapter, which will be respiration. So today we're going to be looking at making the most of photosynthesis. So how humans can exploit photosynthesis to get what we want from it. So what I'd like you to do, without looking back at your notes, the first thing, can you write the word equation, the full word equation for photosynthesis from memory? And then if you want a bit of a challenge underneath it, put the balanced symbol equation. So pause the video now and have a go at that from memory. Okay, so well done for having a go at that. The word equation that you should have is going to be carbon dioxide and water with an arrow, with light and chlorophyll on the arrow, and then the products are going to be glucose and oxygen. The balance symbol equation will be 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O makes C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. So very well done if you remember the symbol equation and also able to balance it. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at how we as humans can increase the rate of photosynthesis. So you need to be able to describe why greenhouses increase plant growth, and comment on cost effectiveness of adding certain things, and discussing the benefits of using greenhouses and hydroponics. And for 7 to 8, explain in detail how using greenhouses can help control limiting factors and increase the rate of photosynthesis, and use data to comment on the cost effectiveness of greenhouses and evaluate the use of greenhouses and hydroponics. Okay, so something to think about. We've got some data here. We've got 3 graphs. On the left-hand side, we've got the wheat production of different EU countries. And on the right-hand side, we're doing a comparison between France and England. France is blue, England is red. And on the top graph, we've got hours of sun per day for each country. And on the bottom bit on the right hand side is the amount of rain per country. So I'd like you to think about, you don't need to write anything, think about France produces more wheat than the UK. Can you think of any reasons for this? So looking at the data you've got in front of you, we can see France produces a lot more wheat than the UK. So why do we think that is? Okay, well done for having a go at that. You probably realise that in France, on average, they have more hours of sun per day, so more photosynthesis can take place. And also, they have slightly more rainfall. And obviously, rain is very important for plants for photosynthesis. So they do not have those limiting factors. Important part of it. We did about limiting factors in a previous lesson. They don't have those factors limiting the amount of photosynthesis that can take place. Okay, so limiting factors and crop production. Now, obviously, the more photosynthesis that happens, the more biomass it makes. Now, bio means living, and mass is the amount of something, so it's the amount of plant that is actually growing. And farmers will obviously want to get their crops growing as fast and as big as possible, because that means that they can feed more people and at the end of the day make more profit. So you want maximum amount of photosynthesis to get fast growing massive plants to make the most amount of money and obviously feed the most people. that's what farmers want to do. Now, in theory, if you give plants a warm environment with loads of light, carbon dioxide and water, they should grow as quickly as they possibly can. But if you are growing crops like most crops are grown out in fields, it's very hard to control any of those factors. So how do you think farmers control some of these factors? How do you think they can control light, carbon dioxide and water? Now, this is going to lead on, that last slide is going to lead on to these questions. So there is very hard to control, but some of the things that farmers might do is have irrigation systems to allow water to access the field. They might have windbreakers from trees, things like that, around the field to get it a little bit warmer. But it is very, very tricky for farmers to control those factors in fields. So what we're going to do is a little exercise thinking about the different limiting factors in photosynthesis. And remember, the limiting factors are temperature, concentration of carbon dioxide, the light intensity, the amount of chlorophyll, but that isn't going to really come up in these questions, and water. So the first thing I would like you to do for parts 1 to 4 is, in each of these situations, identify one factor that is most likely to be the limiting factor of photosynthesis. And in each one, explain why the rate of photosynthesis is limited. So for instance, we do the first one together, and then you can have a go at the other three. A wheat field first thing in the morning. Now you could put two different factors on that. You might say light intensity, or you can say temperature. I imagine most of you are thinking light intensity. So light intensity would be the limiting factor of photosynthesis there, because it's early morning, so there is less light. If you went for temperature, that is also a good answer, because in the mornings the temperature is lower, so the rate of photosynthesis will be lower. So can you now have a go at the same field later on in the day? Plants growing on a woodland floor in winter, plants growing on a woodland floor in summer, and then have a go answering B, explain why it is impossible to be certain which factor is involved in each of these cases. So if you could pause the video and have a go at those questions. Okay, so hopefully we've had a stab at those. We're going to now go over some of the answers you might have come up with. So grab a different coloured pen and let's have a look at how we did. So we already did the first one. So light levels will probably be the limiting factor, because there'll be less light, the sun won't have come up. The next one, later on in the day, carbon dioxide will probably be the limiting factor of photosynthesis. There's very small percentage of carbon dioxide in the air, and if you're a wheat plant in a wheat field, you've got all the other plants removing that carbon dioxide. Woodland floor in winter, so the days are a lot shorter, but there are no leaves on the big trees that are surrounding you. So probably the limiting factor is going to be temperature, because that it's going to be cold, obviously, which means that the enzymes are working a lot slower, so photosynthesis will be very slow. The plants on the woodland floor in summer, it's probably going to be light intensity, because you've got the trees growing with all their leaves. They're stopping the light getting to the floor. Carbon dioxide levels as well could have been an answer, and temperature. because it'll be a lot cooler, obviously, under the leaves. So actually, any one of those would have been good for that. Which leads on to B, which is explain why it's hard, because in natural environments, there's a lot of change between light and temperature and carbon dioxide. If it is windy, for instance, that's going to change the levels of carbon dioxide and the temperature. Less light tends to be the lower the temperature. So they interact with each other, and it's very, very tricky to actually pinpoint one of those things. So very well done if you're able to identify what you thought the limiting factor would be. Very well done if you realise that it's very hard to know which one it's going to be, because naturally occurring environments change so much. Now, because it's hard to control things out in a field, one of the ways that we can have a more controlled environment is using things like greenhouses. And the first greenhouse that we know to have been built was in 30 AD by Tiberius Caesar, who was a Roman emperor, and he wanted to eat cucumbers all year round, not just in the summer. So he made a greenhouse. They didn't have glass though, so they used mica as which is kind of a slightly see-through material that allowed the light through but trapped in the heat, so that he could grow cucumbers and have them in the winter as well. Now, modern big commercial greenhouses now take advantage of what we know about limiting factors. So farmers can use greenhouses, polytunnels, things like that, to get rid of those limiting factors or reduce the limiting factors, just to make sure we get loads of photosynthesis. Now we're going to be looking at some different features of greenhouses. It's not as simple as the greenhouse you may have at home or have come across in the past. There's lots of things that can go on inside a greenhouse to improve farmers' yield, the amount of produce that they make. So we're going to go through each one of those. Can you make a couple of sentences notes just talking about what it is, how it works, and how it reduces the limiting factors? So we're going to start with something called hydroponics, and it's a way in which you can get the maximum amount of water and nutrients to all of the plants. So instead of growing plants in soil, you actually grow them in this solution, and that solution will contain all of the things that they need. Now, there's lots of advantages with growing plants like this. You can get them to grow much faster and bigger because they've got all the nitrates that they need. They're not limited by things like water, so they can get very big very, very fast. Those levels can be controlled, so you're not wasting minerals. You would have specific concentrations so that all of the plants get what they need, and there is less waste. Disadvantages of it is that obviously it costs a lot of money to actually create this system. Once it is up and running, obviously you can use it year after year, but it is very, very expensive to set up. You need to monitor the solutions, so you need special equipment and trained staff to actually do that. And also, if there's something like a pump failure, then that can wipe out whole batches of your plants because they die very quickly without that medium. So we've got some advantages and disadvantages. We've spoken about what it actually is, how it works. So can you pause this video and just put a few sentences about hydroponics, what it is, how it works, and why it's good, but also any disadvantages. Maybe pick out one big advantage and one disadvantage. So pause the video now and do that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is a heating system. And commercial greenhouses will often have heating systems in them. So remember, these can be running in winter as well, not just in the summer. And they can have indirect heat, or they can have hot water pipes. So it's similar to central heating at home. Both use either oil or gas. So burning oil or gas to provide that heat. And it gives lots of advantages, but can be very expensive to run again. Now, also, if you're burning stuff, it's going to make CO2. So you think that that would be useful for the plants, and it is. But also at the same time, CO2 causes or contributes to global warming. So if we're using the indirect heat method, you actually have some carbon dioxide burners, and you have got some pieces of equipment that look like jet engines that will actually heat the air and move it around the system. The carbon dioxide is obviously beneficial because that means that the plants won't have carbon dioxide as a limiting factor, but obviously, as I said before, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The fans inside the heaters will move that air around, making sure that it's warm everywhere, not just where you are burning the oil or the gas. Now, some greenhouses use hot water pipes, and the hot water pipes is kind of like, as I said, the central heating system. So water is heated up and then passed around the pipes, where it cools down, releases that heat into the greenhouse, then goes back again and is re-warmed. The carbon dioxide burners that they use to heat the water have got built-in fans, but that is not actually necessarily going to be pumping the carbon dioxide into the greenhouse. That's because anytime the air keeps moving, you reduce the chances of cold or hot spots, and that causes disease. So can you pause the video now, please, and make a few sentences on heating systems, the two heating systems, what they do, why they do it, and an advantage and disadvantage of both. So pause the video now, please. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be looking at is natural or mechanical ventilation systems. So this is talking about the movement of air around the plants. That's very important because it means that the right gases are getting to the plants. It controls the temperature and also the humidity. And again, there are two different ways in which farmers can do this system. The first one is the natural system, so that is shown by the picture at the top, where you basically just have things like windows at the top of your greenhouse that you can open, and that allows gas to leave the greenhouse, and that can be either because as air gets hot it rises, so it will leave there, but also wind will be passing across the greenhouse, so that will help with the ventilation. Now, having things like those windows is a lot cheaper than the other way, but problems involved in that is if you're opening windows, you're allowing pests and disease into your greenhouse that can cause issues, and also you can't control the amount of wind and things like that. The mechanical ventilation uses big fans again, and those fans just circulate the air around the greenhouses. It will tend to be in massive greenhouses that you would have that. It's obviously a lot more expensive, so that is a disadvantage, but an advantage is that it gives you much more control. You can use it all year round. It doesn't matter whether it's windy, things like that. And also it means that you don't have to open your greenhouse to pests and diseases and things like that. So can we pause the video and make a note of the different ventilation systems, why they need it? So what is it that it's reducing the limiting factor of, an advantage and disadvantage of each. So pause the video now, please. Okay, so the next thing that we can use in greenhouses is artificial light. And like the last one, it can fall into two kind of main categories. You've got supplementary lighting and growing lighting. Now, supplementary lighting is shown in the picture at the top, and that kind of just gives a bit of background lighting. So if it's dark, people can still work in the greenhouses, but it does contribute a little bit of light during the day to boost photosynthesis. Growing lighting is slightly different because growing lighting is used to is specifically for growing plants, forcing them to grow out of season. So you're just giving them lots and lots of light so they kind of think that it is spring and summer, so it forces them to grow and flower and produce those fruits out of season. Now, both types will obviously involve bulbs, and the bulbs that you use are very important. So normal bulbs, or the old-fashioned bulbs, give off a lot of heat. Now, the heat can be useful to your greenhouse because it means that the rate of photosynthesis will go faster, but they cost a lot more to run. So typically LED lights or energy efficient lights will be used instead because it's a lot less money to actually power them, even though they don't produce heat as much as the old-fashioned bulbs do. So if you could pause this video, and if we could put a little bit about artificial lighting in greenhouses, what it is, why they do it, and an advantage and disadvantage. And you can talk about the bulbs for that. Okay, so the last system that we can use in greenhouses to improve crop yield is using an irrigation system. And this is about getting water to your plants so that they're able to grow really big and really quickly. Now, the old-fashioned methods of just using sprinklers or going around by hand with a watering can or something like that is effective, but it does create a lot of waste water. So you tend to overwater in one go. So it does cause wastage of water, but also you tend to get water on the foliage, so the leaves, which reduces the amount of photosynthesis, but also can cause disease or injury to the plants. So we tend to, I'd say farmers will tend to use one of these three methods in watering their plants just to give the maximum, most efficient system of doing it. So the first one we're going to talk about is drip irrigation. And as the name suggests, it's kind of just dripping. So you would have these pipes going around on your plants, and it will release drips of water into the medium or the soil. And that means there'll be a lot less wastewater because it's happening at a very low rate for long periods of time. So that makes it quite a useful system, and also it can be quite cheap. You can do it at home just by putting some small holes into a hose pipe, so it just lets out a small amount. The other method, which is quite commonly used, is water trays and saucers, and it's just where you have a tray underneath the plants, so when you water them, the water goes into the trays, so that reduces the amount of waste water, because that will then obviously get absorbed into the soil as the plant photosynthesizes. Now, quite a more recent and environmentally friendly one is the sub-irrigation system. And in the sub-irrigation system, you do not put the water at the top. You actually put it in these trays underneath, and then the water will move up into the soil from the trays, which means that you're going to have a lot less water waste. You can also put fertilizers and things like that into the water, which will also go up into the medium that the plant is growing in. So if you could pause this video, add a couple of sentences about what irrigation is and an advantage and disadvantage of the systems. I would suggest maybe picking one, because you don't need to know by heart these 3 different ways, maybe picking one that you think is the best and give an advantage of it, and then which is the worst and give a disadvantage of it. So pause the video and do that now, please. Okay, so some of the important parts from the slides that we do need to know from the specification is on this slide. So even though you've made your own notes, I just want to make sure that you have got the important parts for each one in there. So we spoke about hydroponic growing system, and that is a method of growing plants without soil. The roots are constantly in this nutrient solution, and it gives you a very fast growth rate. Burners, such as propane burners, can be used to heat it and produce carbon dioxide. Ventilation, because if it gets too hot, then you want to get rid of some of that heat, otherwise enzymes will become denatured. And there was a couple of methods of doing that, using fans or just old-fashioned windows. Next one, artificial lighting. So it means that photosynthesis can happen throughout the day. Again, there was a couple of options: supplementary lighting or growth lighting. So you might have that in your notes as well. And the last one is irrigation, just giving the right amount of water to the plants. So if you need to add any of that to what you've already written, then pause the video, but I imagine that most of you will have that already. Okay, so we're going to finish off with a question. It's going to use a little bit of data, as you can see on the graph on the right hand side, but also your knowledge of what we've just spoken about to suggest an explanation of why farmers do certain things. So the run up to it, I'll read through this and then you can have a go at answering it yourself. So the cost of running a large greenhouse is particularly affected by the levels of light and temperature. If plants are provided with plenty of carbon dioxide, the grower can get 2 crops a year at 20 degrees Celsius and 3 crops a year at 30 degrees Celsius. Explain why many growers use 20 degrees Celsius rather than 30 degrees Celsius in their greenhouses. So have a look at the information and suggest why you think that they tend to use 20 degrees Celsius instead of 30 degrees Celsius. So pause the video and have a go at answering that question. Okay, so we're going to go over the answer, and well done to those that realise there's a big clue in the words underneath the graph on that slide. So grab a different coloured pen and tick where you have achieved any of these. So first of all, 20 degrees Celsius in the UK is pretty standard, so it's very easily achieved. You don't need anything to make it 20 degrees Celsius. So 20 degrees Celsius is easily achieved. 30 degrees Celsius is higher than the ambient temperature. So that's talking about the temperature of the environment, temperature outside for that. So you'll need a heating system. So to get to 30 degrees Celsius, you're going to need a heating system. Rate of photosynthesis with plenty of carbon dioxide is higher at 30 degrees Celsius than at 20 degrees Celsius. So hopefully you realised that it would seem that 30 degrees Celsius would be better. But if you have to do it at 30 degrees, there's going to be costs involved in heating. And that means that you might make less profit than if you were doing it at 20 degrees Celsius. Okay, So hopefully we're able to make that connection on that of why farmers don't do it at 30 degrees Celsius, even though it seems better as they're getting more crop and things like that. Hopefully we have thought about costs or disadvantages involved in it. So that is it from me today. Hopefully we can talk about some of the ways in which greenhouses increase plant growth, and also try and talk about the cost effectiveness of those. Discussing the benefits of using greenhouses and hydroponics, why is the farmers actually do that. For 7 to 8, explaining how using greenhouses can help control limiting factors. So having heaters in will obviously reduce temperature as a limiting factor, things like that. Using data to comment on the cost effectiveness of greenhouses, which is involved in the last question, and evaluate the use of greenhouses and hydroponics in terms of economics. So using that yield for the farmers, the profit, how it is advantageous to use these different methods. Okay, so that is it. Thank you very much for taking part. That is the last of photosynthesis. So we will be moving on to respiration in tomorrow's lesson. So see you there. Take care of yourselves. Thank you very much, and goodbye.